Let's talk about the Seelie court and the Unseelie court in fairy classification. Here's where we, because I've done it too, tend to mess up right out of the gate. The problem begins with the terms Seelie and Unseelie. They're usually interpreted as good and bad, which is wrong. Seelie is derived from an Old English word that could be translated as happy, fortunate, or blessed. Unseelie, of course, would mean the opposite. Thus, the terms good or bad are more a description of their circumstances, not their nature. While it's easy enough to point out the members of the Unseelie court that really are almost always thoroughly bad, like redcaps and Bavanshi, we do better to look with a little more nuance when speaking of either side. Since I've already had my say about the Unseelie in a previous video, today's examples will come from the Seelie side, and we'll start at the top. The fairy queen, at least according to Spencer, was the epitome of beauty and generosity and all things good, even if he was really sucking up to Queen Elizabeth I. Regardless, there's the Scottish legend of Tam Lin. Tam Lin was a mortal knight who was captured by the fairy queen, who intended to make him a sacrifice. To whom? Good question, and we'll get to that. Why? It wasn't as if Tam Lin had crossed them, and the folklore states that the Fae of the Seelie court were not prone to harming humans for no reason. Now, if Tam Lin had insulted the queen or inadvertently crossed a line of proper behavior, then her plans for Tam Lin would make more sense. The Fae, Seelie or Unseelie, were not known to be forgiving when a mortal crossed or offended them. At best, they would give one chance to make amends or at least give warning before the beatdown. None of that seems to apply here. The only reason I can see for her treatment of Tam Lin was completely self-serving, so far as the queen was concerned. A sacrifice to the devil. One folkloric theory suggests that the Fae were really fallen angels, and the only way they were allowed to remain on Earth was to make a sacrifice to the infernal region every few years. Much better to sacrifice a mortal rather than one of their own. Just saying. So, they took him and transformed Tam Lin into one of the Fae to make him suitable for sacrifice. Fortunately for Tam Lin, he had a human lover named Janet who wasn't going to let the queen get away with taking her guy. She goes to the mythical forest of Carterhaugh on Halloween night and finds Tam Lin there. In his current state, he cannot simply leave with her, but he tells her what she must do if she wants to save him. He tells her the time and place where the queen's court will have a procession. When she sees him there, she must grab him, and under no circumstances should she let him go, no matter what happens or what she sees. Janet meets the procession as instructed, spots Tam Lin, and grabs him. Now the queen isn't going to make it easy for her. She transforms Tam Lin into a snake, a lion, and a whole host of disgusting or dangerous creatures one after the other, but through it all the plucky Janet holds firm. The queen finally recognizes she's beaten. Tam Lin is transformed back into a human, and the lovers happily depart. One assumes the queen then has to find a new sacrifice, but the legend leaves that question alone. While it cannot be said that the queen was either malicious or vindictive here, and likely acting out of necessity, one couldn't really call her intentions good. At least so far as the mortals were concerned. Next, we look at the fairies' capricious nature, and a good example comes from the folklore of Wales, in Glamorgan, in a story first collected by folklorist W. Jenkins Thomas in the Welsh fairy book, 1907, The Curse of Pantannas. Pantannas' farm was owned by an ill-tempered farmer who really didn't like the fair folk, as the fairies were called. They danced on his fields nearly every night, and their music and merriment annoyed him to the point where he schemed to get rid of them. In some versions of the story, he confronted the fairies directly and was cursed by their queen. In another, he consulted with a local witch, who advised him to find any fairy rings in his fields and plow them under with his iron plow and plant the area with corn. With the green areas thus destroyed, the fairies would leave. He did so, and the dancing stopped. No night music, no merry sounds of a party to which he was not invited. The farmer was feeling rather smug about getting rid of the fairies, until he was accosted by a little man who drew a small sword, pointed it at him, and announced, "Vengeance is coming. Fast it approaches." Then the little man disappeared. The farmer tried to laugh it off but couldn't help being unsettled. Yet nothing happened for a while, and he almost forgot about it until it was nearly harvest time. Suddenly his house was shaken by a great noise announcing that vengeance was there. When he awoke the next morning, there was nothing in his fields except ashes. While he was surveying the damage, the little man appeared again and told him that the vengeance had only just begun. By now the farmer understood he was in big trouble, and he begged for pardon, promising he would leave the fairies alone if they would only forgive him. The little man told him that their king had pronounced the curse, and it could not be called back. Yet the farmer begged pardon so humbly that the fairy agreed to speak to his king to see if anything could be done and said he would return in 3 days. As good as his word, the little man returned in 3 days and repeated that the king's curse could not be undone. However, since the farmer had made sincere contrition, the curse could be delayed. It would not reappear in his time nor that of his sons, but afterward it must befall his family. Apparently not caring about his posterity, the farmer was greatly relieved. The green fairy rings reappeared, the fairies danced, and the farm prospered. Except, every now and then the loud voice would repeat that vengeance would come. The farmer and his sons passed from old age, and a century passed before the farm was to be inherited by his descendant, a youth named Maddock. Maddock was betrothed to a girl named Seelie, daughter of a local squire. They held a feast near Christmas at Pantannas to which she and all her kin were invited. Yet, at the height of the feast, a voice spoke that shook the house, saying, "The time for vengeance has come." Maddock later escorted Seelie home, trying to reassure her that everything was all right, but in her heart, she was very afraid. Back at home, his parents awaited Maddock's return, but he never came. The years passed, and still no Maddock, nor any trace of him. Seelie knew in her heart he was still alive, and waited for his return. Even as she grew older, and her hair turned gray, she never gave up hope. His parents died, and finally Seelie herself passed, still waiting for him. Maddock, for his part, thought only a few hours had passed. He had been lured into a cave by strange and beautiful music, but soon remembered his obligations and hurried home. Everything was different, and an old stranger at his door demanded to know who he was. When Maddock told him, the old man said the only Maddock he knew of who ever lived there had disappeared many years before. Maddock realized what had happened and burst into tears, and when the old man touched his shoulder to comfort him, Maddock crumbled into dust. And so, the fairy's vengeance on an ill-tempered old farmer was fulfilled on those who had done absolutely nothing to deserve it. As I said at the start, Seelie and Unseelie do not mean good and bad, especially when we're trying to gauge those words against our human understanding. The Fae are simply themselves, and probably for everyone's greater good, best left that way.